All right, there we go. And I'm also going to go live on Facebook. So this will only take a few moments. Okay.
Yeah, just a white background is okay. It doesn't have to be.
Okay, so right now the computer is getting us live streamed. All right, and we are recording. We are live. And welcome back, everybody, to the latest installment of the Minagåhet Ellet webinar series. My name is Andrew Roberto. I'm from the Northern Marianas Humanities Council. This is the third of 4 scheduled webinars that are based on a survey titled Media Use and Perceptions, Civic Behaviors and Attitudes on Local Issues in the CNMI. Today's episode will focus on news media and cultural values. We are joined today, as ever, by Dr. Francis Dalisay, the head researcher from the University of Guam who conducted the survey. He will present that data shortly, and joining him to give a related presentation on cultural values is activist scholar Manny Cruz. The full recorded webinar episode will be found on our YouTube page. For those joining us, microphones will be muted throughout the entire duration of the presentation. You may make a comment or question at any time using the chat feature. There's a question and answer portion of the webinar at the end, and I will be reading questions aloud. For those using Facebook Live to watch the webinar, please send questions to the Humanities Council Facebook page. Before the start of the presentation, I think I'll give a short bio of both our presenters today, starting with Mr. Manuel Lujan Cruz, Familian Supiano, is a PhD candidate at Auckland University of Technology. He is currently completing a doctoral thesis examining settler colonial discourses in news media and Chamorro activist media frameworks. In August, Cruz will begin a tenure-track position at the University of Guam as an assistant professor of communication and media. Dr. Francis Dalisay is an associate professor of communication at the University of Guam. He teaches courses in journalism and digital communication technologies and is the publisher for Triton's Call, UOG's campus newspaper. Dalisay received MA and PhD degrees from the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication at Washington State University. He earned a BA in communication with a print journalism track from UOG, where he graduated as class valedictorian. Outside of academia, Dalisay has worked as a writer, reporter, editor, and marketing and strategic communication assistant. Gentlemen, thank you for being present on today's webinar. And with that short introduction, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Dr. Dalisay. Please, Francis.
Thank you, Andrew. Buenas tardes and tiro for everyone who's there, who's listening and watching. We'd like to continue on in this installment. What we would do today, let me just go ahead and kick this off, is, wait, where was I at? Yeah, let me just rush through this, this slide here. So what we'll be talking about today here is that in webinar 3 is about community values. And we'll also walk you through perceptions of journalistic functions served by local media, the results for those. But if you recall, these are the topics that were covered for webinar 1, webinar 2, and then the final installment of this series is going to be webinar 4, where we're going to be walking you through the results for political engagement and political interests and attitudes. What I will do today is, again, I'll provide a brief purpose and background on the study that was conducted. I'll walk you through the variables and then the method, and talk about the results, and then just some brief discussion on this, okay? So just to recap, again, for those of you who watched our previous webinars, you've seen these slides already. So the purpose of this survey was to assess CNMI residents' levels along several indicators of engagement in local news media literacy, and involvement in local civic and political processes. And this was a community survey that was conducted in 2020 during the run-up to the local election in the CNMI. And as we mentioned, it was funded by the Mellon Foundation's Democracy and Informed Citizen Initiative. Again, it was during the 2020 election. And as far as we know, this is probably the first among its kind in terms of providing a comprehensive empirical quantitative research study on media engagement and civic vibrancy in the CNMI. Okay, and again, we're going to be talking about community values and perceptions of journalistic functions served by local media for today's webinar. Okay, so just to go through the method employed in this study. Again, this is something that is familiar to you if you've went through and watched the previous webinars, but for the sake of those who were not present there or did not watch the previous webinars, the survey was self-administered using this app called Qualtrics. It's a survey tool, online web tool. And the question items are adapted from measures that have been either validated and or previously used in similar research conducted in the Pacific region, and namely in Guam. And also, prior to even doing anything, what happened is Director Leo Pangilinan here, he put together an advisory board, and they basically went through the project, the methods, the survey itself, the instrument, and just to make sure that it's all relevant to the goal of the study and also relevant to the CNMI. As far as sampling, we use it's kind of like a hybrid of quota, respondent-driven, snowball, convenient sampling. And the thing is that we didn't use probability-based sampling, and so you have to understand that the results I'm going to discuss in a moment are prone to sampling bias. And so with that said, the most important thing here is the last point here. So as with similar community surveys that have been conducted in the CNMI, you have to understand that the results of this survey should be understood only to represent those who responded to the survey. Okay, so that's pretty much that. So just to run down quickly the respondents of the survey: 481 completed responses, with about estimated 73% completion rate. A majority lived in Saipan, while the rest, 3% respectively, lived in Rota, and 3% lived in Tinian. And females outnumbered the males, so we sort of undersampled males. And age range was 18 to 81, and ethnic groups represented include Chamorro at 47.5, Filipino 32.6, and Carolinian 16.7, and Caucasian 7.8% of the sample. Length of residence was in the CNMI range from 1 to 72 years, and the average length of residence was 23. Average, or the median age of respondents is 35, and the median income is between $20,000 to $39,999. Okay, and again, the reason why I went over these demographics is that so you could understand who completed the survey, so that when I talk about the results here in a second, you're going to know that the results are based on these types of respondents. Okay, all right, so now results. So let's get started here. So recall One of the items or variables we're looking at today is this thing called perceived journalistic function served by local news media. And what we did was we took measures from Jeffries and Kumar. These are actually former colleagues of mine in Cleveland State University. But they created this perceptions of journalistic functions served by local media. And so they have distinct dimensions. One of the dimensions is serving as a watchdog for the community. And another one is engaging / developing a sense of community. The other one is like coordinating and socializing the community. So we had 3 items for that. The first dimension, 2 items for that second dimension, and 3 items for that third dimension. And we measured this based on 5 points Likert scale, 1 totally unimportant, 5 equals extremely important. So let me walk you through the results item by item here. So the items measuring serving as a watchdog for the community, here covering CNMI government and government meetings so the public can evaluate government officials. The mean score is 4.54 on a scale of 1 to 5. So yeah, we could interpret this as meaning the respondents viewed this as something that's important to them. Second item, covering crime and law enforcement in the CNMI for the public to monitor. Again, 4.57, close to 5. So respondents feel that's important. Letting the public know what's going on at schools. So 4.67, that's important to respondents as well. The items measuring engaging, developing a sense of community. So getting people engaged in their community, 4.46, that arguably appears to be important for respondents, helping to sustain a sense of community among residents, 4.43. Okay, so that's important for respondents as well. And as far as the coordinating / socializing the community function, connecting people with the community's history and heritage, 4.41 mean score. So yeah, that's, again, arguably that's sort of close to 5. So yeah, then the respondents feel that's important. Providing a way for local businesses to reach consumers, 4.38, also important for respondents. And informing people about community events and activities such as local arts and entertainment, so 4.45. Okay, so that's also important. So when we combine these items to form their respective dimensions, these are the mean scores of that, the combined measure. So in a nutshell, just to sum this up for the audience here, so respondents tended to agree that local news media and the CNMI should serve as a watchdog. That's important to them. Should engage the community / create a sense of community, and should coordinate / socialize the community. Okay. So again, these are the combined averages, or the average of the combined items for each of those dimensions. Okay. All right. So that concludes the perceived journalistic functions. Let me now move on to community values. So we adapted 9 items from existing scales intended to measure values and one trait, it's not really a value here, the trait of conflict avoidance, which I'll explain in a second, that previous studies and previous researchers have documented in the Marianas. The problem is that there is no existing measure for specific cultural values that are indigenous to the Marianas. And so what we had to do is we had to take existing scales that were developed. A lot of these were developed in the West, and so that could be problematic. But nevertheless, this is a start. But anyway, reciprocity is one cultural value that is present in the Marianas. Humility is another one. Respect for elders. There's a sense of community cooperation and interdependence, and a trait of conflict avoidance. Again, that's not a value, but that is something that is that research has found it to be present in Guam at least, and maybe to a certain extent the Marianas as well, or the CNMI as well. And so these are examples of the items here. So reciprocity, to help others is the best policy, to be certain that they will also help you in the future. Humility, one should be humble and modest. One should consider the needs of others. Respect for elders. I always listen carefully to elders and authority figures, sense of community cooperation. In the CNMI, people treat each other with respect. A spirit of cooperation and teamwork exists in the CNMI. And conflict avoidance, I try to avoid discussing controversial or sensitive topics with others. I try to avoid discussing controversial or, sorry, that's, I think I have that twice there listed. It should be just once. Okay, anyway, obviously you could probably attach the indigenous names and titles to these values. In Carolinian and Chamorro culture, they have their own names for these type of things, right? For example, reciprocity, humility, that's embedded within the concept of Centrality, right? And so forth. Inafa'maolek is something that you hear a lot. That's sort of like a sense of community cooperation. But like I said, there are no existing scales out there that we could use that have been developed in Guam that specifically measures those cultural community values. So this is what we had to work with. Anyway, we ran what we call a factor analysis on these items. And what happened is like there's 3 factors emerged from those 9 items. So we interpreted the first factor as reciprocity, humility, respect for elders. The second factor is cooperation, interdependence, and the third factor is conflict avoidance. Okay. If you look at it, I mean, obviously our sample, you saw that's majority Chamorro, right? But if you look at, like I said earlier, reciprocity, humility, respect for elders, that's sort of embedded within this concept of Chinchuli, right? And cooperation, interdependence, sort of like inafa'maolek. And conflict avoidance is, again, this is not a value, it's sort of a trait that we found to be, like I said earlier, it's present in Guam, and it's likely present in the Northern Mariana Islands too. So that's why we included it. Okay, so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna show you how these variables are related to each other, and also how they're related to some of the previous variables we already covered in webinar 1 and 2. And so what we're going to do is we're going to walk you through correlations. These are the correlation results. This is just a quick summary, an overview, a sort of cursory look at the relationship between these variables, okay? And also note what I'm reporting today in this webinar are the results that were only statistically significant results are the ones I'm reporting today, okay? And also, a lot of the variables we're looking at here, I mean, the report were like combined measures, like I said earlier. We combined, like, for example, the items for sense of community, like that, or watchdog function, like those items, that we combine them to form one single variable, okay? And so let me now walk you through the results. So remember in webinar 1, we talked about trust, right, of local news. So let's return to that. And so what we found is trust in sources for local news was positively related with the perceived importance that local news media should serve the functions of creating a sense of community and coordinating and socializing the community. So the more you trusted local news, the more you felt that it's important for local media to create a sense of community and to coordinate and socialize the community, or vice versa. It could be these functions are leading to greater trust, okay? Also, offline political participation was positively associated with the perceived importance that local news media should serve the journalistic functions of creating a sense of community and coordinating / socializing the community. Okay, so the more you participate in offline political behaviors and acts, the more likely you are to feel that it's important for local news to create a sense of community and to coordinate and socialize the community, or vice versa. It could be, again, these two functions are causing offline political participation. Okay. Now we're looking at community values. So the reciprocity, humility, respect for elders factor, we found that to be positively associated with trust of sources for local news. Okay. Also positively associated with use of social media platforms for local news, and positively associated with trust of social media platforms for local news. Okay. Reciprocity, humility, respect for elders was positively associated with the perception that local news media could or should serve the journalistic function of coordinating, socializing the community, motivations for news consumption, and news media skepticism. Okay. So in other words, the more you had the cultural value, you endorse being reciprocal, being humble, respecting elders, the more likely you are to feel it's important for local news to coordinate, socialize the community, and the more motivated you are to consume news, local news, and the more skeptical you are about news media. Okay, but again, this is we don't know what's causing what, so it could be the other way around. Like these variables could be impacting reciprocity, humility, and respect for elders. Finally, reciprocity, humility, respect for elders factor was positively associated with offline political participation. Okay, and interestingly, this factor was also positively associated with political apathy. Political apathy, which I'll explain in the final webinar, is a variable where like you really just totally gave up in politics. You don't even want to be mobilized. You don't even go out there and vote. It's like you just gave up. Okay. Oh, by the way, yeah, the political engagement, as I said, and political interests and attitudes we'll cover in the last webinar next week. All right, a few more things here. The sense of community cooperation / interdependence cultural value factor or community value factor was positively associated with use of sources for local news, trust of sources for local news, and trust of social media platforms for local news. Okay. So in other words, the more likely you feel it's important or you perceive that interdependence and community cooperation exists in the CNMI, the more likely you are to use local news and trust local news and trust social media platforms for local news, or vice versa. It could be that these variables are causing a greater sense of community cooperation and interdependence. The sense of community cooperation or independence factor was negatively associated, however, with the perception that local news media should serve as a watchdog for the local community, but positively associated with news media skepticism. So that's pretty interesting there. So if you tended to feel that CNMI has a good sense of cooperation, everyone cooperates, everyone treats each other with respect, and CNMI interdependence, the less likely you are to endorse and to feel it's important for local media to serve as a watchdog. But the interesting thing is that the more skeptical you are about news media. And the sense of community cooperation interdependence factor was negatively associated with both skepticism and cynicism. Political skepticism is the idea that you are reading between the lines. You don't, like, if you see a news about a politician or political issue, you don't stop there. You go out and you sort of seek more information to to counter or reinforce what you read and so forth. So that's being skeptical, okay? Which is usually it's a good thing to be skeptical. It's not usually a bad thing. But cynicism is like a sort of a mistrust of politics. And so again, the more likely you are to feel that CNMI is there's interdependence, everyone works together, treats each other with respect. The interesting thing is the less likely you are to be skeptical and cynical. Okay, so that's an interesting finding. Okay, I'm gonna speed through this because looks like I might be running out of time here. So conflict avoidance was positively associated with trust of sources for local news and trust of social media platforms. And conflict avoidance was negatively associated with both actual and self-perceived news media literacy, but positively associated with news media skepticism. And conflict avoidance was positively associated with political cynicism and apathy. Cynicism, like I said, is sort of like a mistrust of politicians, the political process, and often like scholars would treat it as something that is sort of like a bad thing for politics. It could be a good thing sometimes. When you're cynical, you could go out. It might lead you to go out there and vote. But most researchers will say it could be a bad thing because cynical people tend not to vote more often. And like I said, apathy is a bad thing. So I think this last bullet point basically reinforces our previous research, which has found that in Guam, at least, those who are conflict avoidant tend to not be willing to discuss controversial topics like the military buildup here in Guam, decolonization issues. Like if you have higher conflict avoidance, you're less likely to discuss those sort of sensitive, controversial topics. And so this sort of like reinforces that. But with the previous findings up here, I don't know, this is pretty novel for me at least, and I'd like to explore this further. With the same data set here that we used, and just try to tinker around with the data some more. Okay, just to close out here. While the items we used were not specifically developed for the Marianas, as I said earlier, they do provide a starting point that future researchers can use to develop an actual scale or measure of values of the Marianas. So that could be important. And as I said in the previous two webinars, every study is not perfect, and this study, as I said earlier, is like those other studies. It's not perfect. Okay, so for one thing, we had sampling error, we had response error. As I explained in the previous webinars, you could just read these bullet points here on your own, but there's a trade-off here. We were able to gather a lot of data here, pretty rich, in moderately large size sample that we could work with, and that's a trade-off. And also it's cross-sectional. This is a survey research. We don't know what's causing what in these variables, but again, this provides foundation for future studies. And just to conclude here, so on balance, the results above imply that there is a complex cultural value system in the CNMI that could potentially enhance or be enhanced by engagement in local news, trust of sources for local news, and other key civic indicators. However, the trait of conflict avoidance could potentially inhibit political participation and associate with political disaffection. And we can further examine the role of community values and civic processes in the CNMI. For example, if in fact certain values have a pro-civic capacity, perhaps public campaigns aimed at increasing civic engagement in the CNMI can adopt community values or community values-centered messaging. We can compare the results of the present study with those of other studies conducted in the region. I've been mentioning in previous webinars that I also, around the same time the data for this study were conducted, we also collected data on Guam with almost identical items. And so we're going to be analyzing that in the future. All right, and so that concludes my my presentation. Sorry I took longer than I thought I would, but again, next week we'll be talking more about political engagement. But if anything, you could send me an email if you are interested with learning more or have any questions. Okay, thank you. Take care.
All right, Francis, as usual, fascinating data. And I was taking notes as you were presenting, and I've got a bunch of questions for when it's appropriate. Okay. I may be having technical difficulties. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, on my side, I'm just having a little bit of issues, okay, with connection. But Manny, I'm still gonna try to mute myself and then hand the floor over to you. All right, so feel free, Manny, to take it away.
Okay, I'm unmuting and off day, everyone. My internet over here in Altedo is also a little bit choppy today, so just bear with me if I freeze. But I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. And does everyone see that okay? Yeah? Okay. All right, so half a day, everyone. Thank you to Dr. Dalisay, Andrew, and Leo for inviting me to participate in today's webinar. Guahusi Manny Cruz. That was a very interesting set of data, Dr. Dalisay, and I just want to share some of my findings from my doctoral thesis in relation, and particularly the creation of a media framework I've created in collaboration with fellow activists in Guahan, which I'm calling the Fanny Guiden. But first, I want to give you guys a brief overview of my doctoral thesis, Aniti. So Aniti takes place over the case of, so 3 case studies, and they cover discursive events during COVID-19, as well as the North Korean missile crisis in Guahan in 2017. And what I look at are what I employ are ideological critiques using settler colonial theory, basically to determine how settler colonial militarist ideology is present in the mediascape in Guahan. And so in so many words, what I found essentially is that military activity and development on Guahan are often framed as overtly positive, with proponents claiming potential economic and security benefits, while adverse impacts are either downplayed or omitted. Simultaneously, the media closes off Timoru claims to sovereignty, and we see this play out in different ways in the mediascape. And so if we were to look at the joint defense meeting held in last August between the US and Japan, the media portrays the country's military activities as a benevolent cause against a common foe, asserting itself in the region. What isn't talked about, however, is the impact of the projected increase in military activity, or even the potential impacts of a regional conflict to the people of Guahan, which faces the risk of, quote, landing of Chinese Special Operations Forces to ballistic missile attacks and cruise missiles from the air. News coverage of the Davis case was also looked at, and I found that it was used to diminish Timoru claims to sovereignty while simultaneously reinforcing the perception of the Davis outcome as beneficial, just, and absolute. In terms of settler colonial ideological power, coverage of the Davis case reified the power of settler legal frameworks and the overarching plenary power of the federal government over its U.S. territories. And then in looking at the USS Theodore Roosevelt COVID outbreak last year, I saw how the media and settlers in the media strategically employ one Guam rhetoric to portray a unified and equal military-civilian partnership. And at the same time, Chamorro activists were also the subject of dehumanizing rhetoric and enemies of this one Guam order. And in a national and international sense, you can also use the event to study how Guahan is talked about as the tip of America's spear, and how there is this constant rediscovery of Guahan, and that there just so happens to be an American military presence there without any sort of critical inquiry. For a lot of activists, these results are unsurprising. And as a former journalist, I always felt a sense of dissonance in that the work that I was doing and the system I was an active participant in was also doing so much damage to indigenous rights while aiding and abetting US imperialism. And throughout my research process, through talking with other journalists in Guahan, what I found was that quite a number of fellow local journalists shared the same internal conflict with their personal views and the type of news that they or the companies they work for are producing. And so I have sought to find a way to better inform news practices in Guahan while recentering Chamorro worldviews and further to subvert and oppose settler colonial militarist hegemony. I've tried to piece together a framework from a set of conversations with fellow media activists who operate under a set of ideological assumptions informed by decolonization and Chamorro beliefs, as opposed to a capitalist settler colonial militarist logic. And so Chamorro activists in different ways who participated in the study stated media should be empowering. Mainstream media on Guahan is largely disempowering currently, in that there is a distrust in the government's ability to function independent of the United States, and on a broader scale of the Chamorro people's ability to be anything without the United States. In contrast, Chamorro activist discourses are resurgent, and that they nurture ideations of a Chamorro future outside of settler militarism. And so, for instance, one of my friends and a fellow activist that I interviewed was Lawrence Lizama, the producer of Fanatsu. And Lizama stated, "For me, I feel like it inspires me, his media practice. It inspires me to want to do more for my people. It makes me want to empower others so that we can really believe in ourselves, not continue this path of feeling inferior and like we need to be always someone's welcome at, pretty much. Especially with the whole inafa'maolek tourism thing, right? No longer being someone's tuntagu." So if we look at the other aspect of this Fanny Guides and model is Matsulapun, which my Nana was so kind enough to encourage me to use. So Matsulapun is transgenerationality. And I spoke to a fellow journalist in Guam who said that, I mean, for me, I feel like the work I do is more for the community. It's so that we're coming together as a nation. It's not, I mean, it'll be beneficial for myself, but I'm not doing it for me personally. I always have my family in mind and future generations. And you can sort of read the rest of this quote, but you already get a sense of how it's his family and his community that informs the media practice that he does, despite the constraints on him in the workplace. And you also see this with content creator Mina Nicholas. On Instagram, her handle is Decolonized Donny, and she creates these really cool infographics and memes that try to reclaim what it means to be Micronesian. And she says it wasn't until colonization that we now have like ugly things like colorism, internalized racism, which I think is a big problem here on Guam, and it's slowly starting to become more of a problem within the NMI as a territory. So I do also want to address this, and I want to do it in a way that's like remembering to be more empowering and affirming of our identities as navigators. So it's the sense of like reaching back to what it means to be Micronesian in order to empower ourselves and each other. With the other aspect of this model called Gehalom, which is the centrality of historical context, there is much to be said about the culture of hyper-immediacy in our society and how this is perpetuated by breaking news. Newsrooms currently race to be the first to publish a story before their competitors. We are constantly inundated with notifications, and so much of everything we consume is meant to feel perpetually new, including settler colonialism and militarization, which is often the case when national or international news outlets come to Guam or try to report on issues about Guam, right? But what each of the Chamorro activists I interviewed shared with me is how much they despise that news media portrays these current conditions in Guam as new and lacking any sort of context. It's as if things like lack of resources or food insecurity or militarization, it's as if these phenomena are things that occur in a vacuum. Chamorro activists, however, elucidate in their media practice how current conditions of inequality are tied to historical and ongoing oppression. Siobhan McManus, in this excerpt, talks about the issue of homelessness and how, in this one instance that she's talking about, there is no context being given for homelessness in Tuman. All we're told is that it's negative and it's obscene, and yeah, you guys can reflect on this for a moment. But essentially, in the media practice that activists do, everything is always tied to history, and there's always historical context present. Okay, the final bullet points, the final aspect of this model, manhali, groundedness, illustrates how Tomorrow media activists don't only create media, but in every case they are rooted in their communities and in different ways with the land. Tomorrow activists, media activists are weavers, they are canoe builders, and they are planters, as opposed to a Western news media model in which journalists are wage earners or wage laborers. Tomorrow activists are connected to the community through the practices that they do outside of creating media, whereas journalists function because they need to pay their bills, which is a sentiment that a lot of fellow journalists shared with me. They feel compelled to do the work that they do because they have bills to pay, and so yeah. So at the same time, mainstream news media presents a top-down, one-way communication model, whereas Tomorrow media activists always include the community in the process of media production. And so Keith Suzukico here, who is a graphic artist with Independent Guahan, in this excerpt, he reflects on how his current role as a volunteer with Independent Guahan, it sort of came to him. He was already a graphic artist, and he felt compelled to make a difference in his community, and he found a way. And at the same time, Independent Guahan was fluid and open enough to include his abilities into their workflow. And so he creates a lot of the visual content that you'll find on Independent Guahan's page, such as the Nalala Songs for Freedom concert posters and such. So these are just some of the ways that Tomorrow activists using Fanny Gaiden are actively countering and subverting seller ideology and power. And by recentering Tomorrow worldviews, this continues to be an integral to the project of decolonization and demilitarization of the Marianas. And so that concludes my presentation. Thank you. I'll pass it over to Andrew.
All right, Manny, thank you for that. I'm just testing my audio. It looks like I'm freezing up. How are you guys? Can you guys hear me and see me okay? Doing a test. Can you guys hear me and see me all right? Okay, I'm freezing a little bit on my side. Sorry about that. Okay, so I have a number of questions for both of you guys. Okay, but because I want to shoot perhaps the first question over to Francis. Okay, Francis, during some of your data sharing, you said that conflict avoidance is a trait. I think I'm generally right. I'll accept that with allowing, of course, for differences in personalities, right? That it maybe in some sense there's a lot of conflict avoidance, but then also some of the data that you picked up said that community members view the media as a watchdog. Could you talk a little bit about the connections there? If the community values avoiding conflict, how is it that they also see the news media as a watchdog, which is very likely to start conflict or encounter conflict as it watchdogs the community? And then, you know what, after that, Francis, I'm gonna shoot. I have a related question for Manny.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Andrew, for that question. Let me just share this screen quickly again. This were the conflict avoidance results for correlation. So to answer your question, it doesn't look like conflict avoidance was related with what the watchdog function. And so the results I'm reporting here were the only ones that were statistically significant. And so, yeah, maybe that's why, because it's, the two are not related. Maybe that explains the reason there, in terms of what your questions, what you've asked. It could be that conflict avoiders, they don't view, or they don't endorse the watchdog view. That could be it. Because yeah, in local news, right, there's gonna be conflict. There's gonna be things like bad news that's going on in the government, in the schools, and so forth. And oftentimes that those stories will have conflict, and that's just Western journalism, right? You report on two sides, and it's usually one side is saying something, and the other, and it's conflict, and yeah, and that's basically it. And so, in other words, it's not associated with it, and so that means, and that could mean that conflict avoiders are not likely to endorse the watchdog function.
Mic test. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So now here's my related question. Manny, in the current political environment, perhaps I should say, on Guam, decolonialization is it fair to say it's a controversial topic? Because when traditional media does report on efforts of decolonialization, if you go online and look at the comment section, it's almost like World War III in there. Now I understand that the data that you presented, or I'm sorry, the presentation that you made today is about various other framings that decolonial media producers, content creators, they're trying to make a different sort of, I guess, media. Is that fair to say? Now when they go off and they start talking to community members, are they experiencing some avoidance of conflict when they bring these things up, or are they coming into conflict as they share their media, as they share their content? Manny.
So there's multiple parts to that question, and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. But I'll Quentin Tarantino this, and the last question that you asked, I'll address that first, and that's it's sort of it's in a way it's probably not healthy, but in a way, for many activists, it's kind of a rite of passage that you engage in very heated and very conflict-driven conversations with our family members. In this political awakening as an activist, oftentimes the people that you turn to first to sort of share your knowledge and to hold these conversations with are people in your family who may not share the same ideas as you around militarization, the military buildup. And so, yeah, it's there is always an element of conflict from the get-go when you are an activist that you have to sort of engage in and sort of navigate. So is decolonization a divisive topic? Yes. And in relation to the data that I presented, the reason that it is a divisive topic is because the overarching logic that the mainstream mediascape functions under makes it a divisive topic. So mainstream media, the mediascape basically defines the limits of the conversations that we're able to have around this topic. And so if the overarching ideology of the mainstream media, regardless of which company, is that America is good, America, the land of the free, we liberated you, everyone should just be grateful for what we have now.
Sorry, Manny, you're cutting off.
And
Okay.
that indigenous sovereignty or anything that. And I think I froze. I hope you guys got all that.
I'm sorry, Manny. We got we didn't get everything that you said, but I did get a comment on Facebook. I'm going to read it out loud. This comes from Jesse Tsotgaloff on Facebook. This is directed at Francis. Ungen Francis, conflict avoidance seems rooted in the idea of respeto. News media seems newer and a bit tai respeto, although I'm not saying it isn't necessary these days to some respect. Now, guys, we do have a time frame. I apologize for that, but I want to ask a question, and this is directed actually at both of you presenters today. This is something I was taking down as we start considering cultural values that are represented in traditional media, right? I got a question about cultural appropriation. Is it cultural appropriation if an editorial room that is not mostly Chamorros tries to create content based on Chamorro values? I don't know if that's related to the particular data collected, but gentlemen, feel free. I want to hear your thoughts on it. And I think,
Can you
Manny,
repeat the question again?
yeah. Is it cultural appropriation if an editorial room that is not mostly Chamorro tries to create content based on Chamorro values?
Man, you could probably answer that question better than me.
As a cultural,
Francis, it was something that pops up into my mind as I'm reading some of these things, because you know, I'm gonna center this back on in the CNMI. I'm not familiar with how many Chamorro reporters are on Saipan. It could be that there are majority. I just would not know. But I'm gonna assume that's not the case. But Manny, what do you think? Is it cultural appropriation if an editorial room that is not mostly Chamorro tries to create content based on Chamorro values?
Well, to directly answer your question, and before my internet cuts out again, I don't think it's cultural appropriation. And also, the problem isn't whether or not there are Chamorro people in the newsroom or not, because with my data, in my data collection period, I do speak to other Chamorro journalists, as well as journalists from the extended Micronesia. And despite their good intentions, and despite their own personal views and how they try to engage with critical issues, well, the problem is that the model or the structure that they're operating under is capitalist, it is militarist, it is colonial, and these are the things that more so influence the type of news that they produce. And in fact, I think that actually engaging with Chamorro values, or even a decolonial media framework, such as the one I'm proposing as well, would be extremely beneficial, not just for reporters, but obviously for the community at large in U.S. territories like Guahan or the CNMI.
What should they do about creating content in the according to values that are not Chamorro? Because I mean, we do have different populations on this island who do read the news. So what about the cultural values that they might have, and the kind of cultural sensitive or cultural centered topics of, say, like a Marshallese community or a Palauan community? We have a fairly large Palauan community on Saipan. And then of course the Rafalawash community, right? Although we have similar values, and we have different perhaps ways of executing them. So what about in that sense about the different cultures that are found in the Marianas?
Yeah, the beauty of our region and our cultures is that when you look at our history, our pre-colonial history, you quickly understand that the divisions that we see amongst ourselves are fabricated by the overarching political and social structure. Everything, basically Americanization, American settler colonialism, all of these things. And so by engaging with, say, if we're talking about Guahan, then very explicitly, it is Tsumoru land, it is indigenous land, and I don't see an issue with operating under a Tsumoru worldview. If this Tsumoru worldview encourages us to relate to each other in a way that predates these colonial structures, because there is the sense of interdependence amongst ourselves and with our brothers and sisters in the larger Micronesia and Oceania. So I think these are things that would be completely beneficial.
Okay, thank you for that, Manny. I think, just based on time, guys, I'm sorry, I could, this is like a can of worms to me, and I could talk about this till tomorrow. But, I just want to send a question over to Francis, right? What could it look like? And also, Manny, of course, you can address this. What could it look like if a newsroom created content based on cultural values?
I think you probably would have to start at a local, regardless of like if it's CNMI or in Guam. It's like, for example, the one I could think about that pops up in my mind right now is what happened in the PDN recently, where they're owned by Gannett, and a local Kaleo Moylan, he bought it out. And now they're trying to shoot for more local coverage, and in a way, you read their content, it has more of, at least from anecdotally, I see it has that more of a community, local, tomorrow sort of values into it in their coverage. And the Western journalistic values I went over, like watchdog, engaging, developing a sense of community, coordinating, socializing the community, those can be easily weaved in native indigenous values in the Marianas, right? And the issue is like, and maybe Manny knows better than me on this, like knows more about this in terms of what they're doing in New Zealand, right? He could probably share maybe what he's seeing there and how indigenous cultures weaved in what they do in New Zealand. And so, yeah, I mean, honestly, the more local media embrace indigenous values, it's better off for the community, right? Because then they're accountable. They hold leaders accountable for taking care of the land, making the best decisions for the people here, right? And I think that's gonna be good. But yeah, anyway, that's all I got.
Yeah, definitely. So New Zealand has a very, I guess, compared to the US, obviously a very progressive sort of relationship that it has with the Maori people. And yes, there is Maori news. There are Maori radio stations for every iwi or tribe. But these aren't things that just came about. These are things that the government has been compelled to do through the Treaty of Waitangi. And so there is this political structure in place that makes things like Maori news possible. What could news look like with embracing Tsumoru values? First of all, currently, the media structure on Guam functions under the logic of settler colonialism. And settler colonialism is the replacing of the elimination of the native, essentially. The taking of land in order to replace the native population with, in this case, military bases or settlers, people who are tied to military activity on Guam. So that is the overarching logic of the current media structure. If you were to look at it and employ a counter structure like the Feni Gaiden, the logical outcomes of the type of media that we create would be totally different. So if the outcome is to empower communities and to work towards decolonization, then the material, the political, the social outcome of this news reporting would be to do these things, to accomplish decolonization and to return Samoru land to Samoru people.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you for your time. Unfortunately, that's where we're gonna have to leave it. But like I said, I would like further discussion on this because of how important I perceive the media to be, and on top of just like, you know, the admiration of the culture and the community on CNMI. I want to thank my presenters for today, but we're gonna have to sign off, and until next time. All right, thank you very much. Esta.